communities indicators for where's that need the greatest. So if we're only going to fund about 75 to 80 schools, where are they most needed? So that capacity is absent. And I think this is a situation that is ubiquitous through most ministries of the partner countries that we work with. So really, the way my perspective on this conversation and the reason why I'm so thankful for this dialogue today is that if we are going to begin to talk about using data to enhance development, the ability of a country's own national statistics office, national statistics system, and by that I mean the broader set of in-country stakeholders like ministries, civil society, and even citizens, have to have the ability through data and the power to come to the table at each place of the decision-making process. So really, what I'm going to talk a lot about is that the importance of investing in creating that context where the citizens and civil society in the country, so not we, have the ability to gain the skills needed to engage into the data revolution. So that data culture that I think I heard Manuel Toise mention. So this is a little bit of an introduction to the rest of it.
Okay, I'll be brief. Hi, my name is Priya, Vora. I'm with Future State. We're a very small new team. All of us who are part of the Future State team are guilty of having spent the last 10 or 15 years really advancing issues of digital development. So in my case, I spent the last 15 years both at the Gates Foundation and USAID trying to encourage greater investment in connectivity, payments platforms, digital health services, and so forth. And all of us left kind of concerned about, well, what happens with the resultant data? So Future State is a new program of the UN Foundation, and we're working to kind of analyze what governments around the world are doing on data governance issues, working with clients like the World Bank, Oxford, and others to advance a vision of keeping citizens and people at the center of a data governance paradigm.
Hi everyone, I'm Dhanaraj. As you heard, I started the Web Foundation. The Web Foundation was set up several years ago by Tim Berners-Lee with a broad mandate of promoting digital equality globally, but especially in low and middle income countries. And what that means is we focus on policy advocacy and research in three main areas: one around broadband access and affordability, gender equality, and what's an emerging work stream for us now, data rights and gender, which in turn has been built upon several years of work on open data issues, open government data issues. So for us, when we think of data governance and data rights issues, we focus primarily at a policy level. And our work, as I mentioned, is in low and middle income countries, and we approach this primarily from a rights-based approach. So that means that we think of policies and programs, whether in terms of data collection, data access, use, as being aimed at fulfilling human rights. So that can involve improving the capacity, whether of data stewards, of people holding data, or of people at the individual level, people using data to meet those obligations. Our argument and our motivation is that that kind of effort will promote broader equality within societies. We see, therefore, that our work is intentionally focused on equality, data protection, data privacy, policies that promote equality. And in turn, one key aspect of that for us is gender equality. So, for example, one of our interests is to look at the extent to which data protection regimes are gender responsive. Given the fact that public policies by themselves often focus on the status quo without thinking of individual or differential situations, for example, between men and women or other groups in society. So our work is primarily driven by research and policy advocacy at these levels. I just end the intro by mentioning our major advocacy initiative at this point called the Contract for the Web, which includes several principles that aim to bring together these kinds of what we call good practices around data protection, and which embodies this right-based approach. So calling for governments, corporations, civil society groups, and others to incorporate different kinds of rights into their data protection rules and practices, both at the individual and organizational level. this contract for the web is something, and the principles within it address data protection is something that has been worked on by several hundred different global companies, including some of the major tech companies in the world, governments, civil societies, and various individuals. And I can bring it up later on as we discuss it.
Hi everyone, I'm Shaida Badiee. I actually wear several hats today, which might be useful for this conversation. One is, of course, my day job is open data and trying to encourage open data in developing countries and providing all sorts of support for open data. And also, I'm advisor to Data 2X and working on closing gender data gaps. And there are lots of different initiatives underway there, which I think is very relevant to the conversation we're having today on gender data. And finally, I'm also co-chairing Sustainable Development Solution Network thematic data on called Trends, which is looking into researching different forms of data governance. What the space that I really been working on for a long time, for 36 years at the World Bank and now in the civil society space, is really official statistics. And I think there is one moment to take to really appreciate this sector. It's usually looked at as sort of a, behind the scene sector, is usually looked at maybe not more as innovative as other sectors of data are. Excuse me, but it's really the governance and the responsibilities and the role that they have, as Claire was saying, in the ecosystem of the government data is tremendously important. This official statistics, as you see, supporting and serving, for example, SDGs, is governed very well by at the high level by the UN Statistical Commission. This is one of those commissions that's really what I call a very functional commission, which is very actively actually governing the official statistics and the SDG framework. And one of the principles that runs it is called Fundamental Principle of Official Statistics, which was formed a few years ago, and in fact, about 6 years ago this week was blessed and endorsed by the General Assembly. So it's really a set of principles that maybe could be guiding and helping us as we move forward with this expanded data governance that we are all hoping that we can achieve. And this community, of course, has a lot to offer, but this community also has a lot to learn. And we're going to be through our discussions, and Agnieszka actually referred to as some of the capacity issues and under-investment issues that we are experiencing. And without building those important building blocks at the government for official statistics, I think we're going to have a very hard time talking about any of these other regulations, maximum increasing use, and really increasing the value of data. So my position is really advocacy for official statistics within governments with collaboration in a sort of a model where I call government plus plus, that we will have the governments, the UN, and other civil societies come to the picture. So hopefully we'll talk about that some more. Thank you.
Thanks, Shaida. So one of the things I found striking about the conversation this morning, and also it reflected, I think, very well the change in tone over how the development community is thinking about data and digital tools that's happened maybe over the last 2 years, maybe particularly over the last year, on where the tone has kind of shifted from focusing on how is more and better data going to get us to a better place to greater emphasis on challenges and risks. And oftentimes those challenges appear myriad and very complex and difficult to address. But I'm on a panel with individuals who got into a career, I think all of you are taken by the idea of using these tools to reach better outcomes. So, and I want to leave our audience, I know we're halfway through the event, but I want people to walk away not feeling down, or you said guilty. And the way to do this, I think, is to start talking about possible solutions. I mean, how do we get from conceptualizing the challenges and the harms to solutions in this space? And I'll just leave that open for different panels. Yeah, Priya.
Okay, well, so I think it's important to start with nobody's figured this out. These are issues that every country is grappling with, and I think what's heartening is to think that developing countries actually may have an opportunity to establish a posture towards data now before they've fully digitized and maybe are trying to kind of retrofit rules afterwards. So I just want to give a couple of examples of things that I've seen that give me some hope that it's not all doom and gloom. Just for example, Vivian Foster, you asked the question, how do you break up the possibility of an omniscient entity? And I was thinking about that over the break, and there are two, both in the US and now in India, the US is contemplating this idea of a custodial third-party agent, and in India they've introduced what they call account aggregators. Both are, means of separating consent, can I get your consent for your data from the data collector? And there's, in both countries or in both pieces of legislation, the idea is there's just an inherent conflict of interest between someone asking for your data and someone asking for your consent, because of course they're going to hide all the terms and conditions in small font and you won't understand it. But this idea that there might be a third-party fiduciary whose loyalty is to the end individual, whose whole job is to make sure you understand what you're consenting to, understand where your data is being shared. Much more like my financial manager helps me manage my money and understand, how to translate my risk-reward appetite into actual investment opportunities. That's what this kind of fiduciary model tries to do. So I know it sounds really technical, but I remain optimistic that there are institutional innovations that are being tried. I don't think there's any answer, but I think it would serve us well on this panel to try and unearth examples like that give a sense that there's something to do.
Solutions are out there.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm happy to follow on that. I am personally still very optimistic. I'm an optimist at heart, but I have to say also that through this work on the data collaboratives, whose goal felt impossible to sort of achieve at the beginning, because really the goal of this effort was to, within a fairly short period of time, 3 to 5 years, demonstrate that it's possible to see this data culture and the greater use of data for evidence-based decision makings at numerous different levels in some demonstration countries, in Tanzania and Cote d'Ivoire, places where MCC and the partner with whom we've been doing this, PEPFAR, both have operations and need those informed counterparts and civil society to be part of the dialogue. So what's been exciting about the data collaboratives is because it is a complex challenge, we took a complex systems approach. For those of you who understand systems thinking, it's kind of trying to get at the problem in many different simultaneous ways in such a way that the system is shocked into change. And then you look at where those changes are, you pick the positive reinforcing wheels of that and you build on it. So what does that mean in practice? That through the engagement with local institutions that already had some angle related to data, we started talking about how do you augment that? How do you bring in youth into that space? Because again, Africa, youth bulge, 60% are youth. So this is a good time to be thinking about this. And one of the things that we heard in a recurring way is actually there is data out there, but nobody is using it. Right? Tanzania actually 5-6 years ago had open data portals with the location of all their health centers, water points, and all sorts of other information that nobody was using. So the model we started testing is, let's develop a center of data use, the Tanzania Data Lab. Let's fund ways, innovation challenges that brought youth into this and ask them to connect this existing data to solutions within subnational areas. Let's go to those subnational areas, because one thing we're not talking about here either is it's one thing to be talking about the data revolution in some of the capitals of those cities, but where development needs the greatest in the rural areas. where that capacity is even weaker. And so we went out to the subnational areas and started to something called listening campaigns, collected that data and gave that data back to the officials and the communities to see what they could do about the problems that are there with the information that they have. So there are signs of change. I could talk here about the numbers of people trained, more than 2,000, 3,000 organizations involved, 2.4 million community data points generated by the communities themselves so that they learned about the process. And now the National Bureau of Statistics in Tanzania is interested in sort of officializing the use of citizen-generated data. They're one of the few countries in Africa that are thinking about that. But beyond those numbers, what I am personally most excited about are those signs of longer-term change. The fact that as a result of this data lab that I mentioned, and that it was co-located at the university decided to start a master's in data science, the first one in East Africa. We are now in the second cohort of the Tanzanian data scientists being trained. There are very few data scientists in Africa, and so how are we talking about sustainable development with country-level participation when there are no data scientists? So these are some of the glimmers of hope. And also, I think, pathways and examples of what not to do as well. And I don't mean to get into the risks, but being kind of a funder as well, one of the things that I don't like to see is us undermining the building of that local data ecosystem. All too often as funders, we're pressured by timelines and milestones, and so we will go around the National Statistics Office or National Statistics System, create our own channel to get that data because we have to, because we need to do it fast. So how does that help over the long term?
With low and middle countries, and then the methodological approach, both in a sense give me a sense of cautious optimism. One is around thinking, what is the approach here, and for us, we have thought that we need to be more critical about the notion or idea that it's companies, governments, or stewards that who are currently in charge of data and who view data often in some maybe perhaps as a toxic resource or a precious resource, and therefore view it as something to be protected. And that becomes problematic in a sense. The whole idea of data protection is what becomes problematic if we want to move, and we do want to move to placing the emphasis on individuals as the active agents that drive the use and therefore the nature of collection our own data. In doing that, and we have an open data lab in Indonesia, in Jakarta, that has for years experimented around different open data initiatives, but now has a new project around data empowerment, which is based on this very principle that I just described, which then leads to a methodological approach where we start with, as Agnieszka said, a kind of systems mapping, understanding of what is the ecosystem there locally with local governments. So we're working with local governments there, 4 local governments, to understand what are the government's situation, the civil society perspectives, and individual community group perspectives on how data-driven solutions can solve local problems, whatever those might be. And then, based on that, working to build coalitions that involve all those actors to help drive the kinds of policy and recommendations at the local level. That is the approach that we're taking right now. It's not complete. So I'm just saying that it does look, in my mind, a good approach that obviously will have to be evaluated and tested, but it's happening right now at the local level in Indonesia.
If I can just add one more thing in terms of this evaluation and testing. So we are at the stage where we have outputs and some outcomes, and we're actually trying to independently evaluate whether this methodology is working. One of the things that, again, is promising, it's not complete, this is a complex system, is if you've heard of things like social network analyses. So what's interesting about the systems approach, we have seen from our work in Tanzania and yet to be seen in Cote d'Ivoire that this type of investment does create this ripple effect in the system. What does that mean? That means that what it has been able to detect is that there is now greater interest in data and data use by stakeholders that were not touched directly by the investment. And so that's exciting as well in terms of giving us hope that that things are working.
Just a couple of good, sorry, I'm coming out of a cold. Couple of good signs to highlight here. One is that we really, and it's amazing to see how many countries, the national statistical offices, in fact, are embracing these alternative data sources and trying to innovate and use that data to complement official statistics, which is a huge step forward for the work that we're all talking about. But, for example, in Ghana, I was there a month or so ago, and it's really impressive how they're using citizen-generated data, contracts with Vodafone, using cold data, but not only for experimentation, but what's happening is they really realize that their sort of enabling environment also needs to be shifted. So, in fact, Ghana just passed a law and legislation where the National Statistical Office is made more independent and also made in charge of coordinating within the government agencies. So it's really nice to see that this innovation for good cause is also leading to really positive reform. The other thing that we see that is actually also very positive is that we, the civil societies, beginning to see how we can be supportive of the structure that Agnieszka was mentioning, that the countries are in driver's seats and we are there to support them, but not really to build parallel systems, and try to see how we can support them. And one of the latest initiatives that Stefan also mentioned is this contract for data sharing, where there's been a library generated by the STSM Trends of all the various contracts that we know so far of between public and private or between different groups for data sharing, so that a new group, when they're starting, they don't have to start from scratch. It came up from an initiative where in Colombia we were trying to build a partnership between the commerce and the statistical office, and it took 10 minutes for them to agree, but 6 months to actually draw out the contract. So we really found out that these are the kind of things, these are the positive, small contributions that could really make big sort of change.
Can I just ask you, in either of those cases, are you seeing those countries, Colombia or Ghana, now also introduce the kind of broader changes at the policy level or institutional to make sure that people are part of the equation, or they understand how their data is being used, or they have new rights over it? I mean,
well, my answer would be yes, but if you do the reality check of looking from the result matrix, from the result is not really demonstrable yet. Mm-hmm. So we're still in a sort of a sandbox and experimentation with really good results, because we promise to be positive, right? Yeah. So we see really good results, but we really have to also keep that result focus in this whole data governance. If you look at the result focus, we're still learning on that. I just did a quick calculation with one of my staff before coming here, of looking at the countries that have done very good planning. They have good national statistical plan, and they've repeated it and they've updated it between the last few years. And then also looked at the statistical capacity indicator of the World Bank to try to see whether the countries that planned well, that means a proxy for governance, I know it's wrong, I shouldn't say that, but the countries that plan well, do actually get results. And you have a mixed result. About 56% of the 124 countries that we looked at, actually the capacity improves, but some of them actually don't, or stay the same or decrease. So to answer your question, we're still in the learning mode and experimenting and developing, but it's looking positive.
So I actually just want to go back quickly to something Dhanaraj said in the first round of kind of talking through your organizational approach. And you said the Web Foundation approached a lot of these issues from a rights framework. And one question I have is, when we think about the goal of achieving balance in this space, usually we're talking about trade-offs, right? Trading off costs and benefits, the risks we want to protect you against the rewards that we think we might be able to reach. But how do you have that conversation on trade-offs if you're coming and I'm not saying a rights framework is the wrong way, but I'm trying to understand, if you're coming from this issue from a rights framework, you can't really trade on rights, right? So do you approach these issues from a different conceptual basis, or does that make sense?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I'm not sure if it's okay. Our approach would not be to try to substitute it for something else, but to try and ensure that we get the right balance, right? Once, I know a couple years ago, so if you use a parallel with internet access, there have been several initiatives in low-income countries to provide people with internet access, which is a kind of inferior form, often not accessing the entire open web. In India, for example, there was a pushback against initiatives around that, which labeled them as poor internet for poor people. We would not, when we come back to this issue around trade-offs, there's this concern that, you want to provide people with certain kind of services, but those services might, because of the nature of the situation, because we are people with less effective payment, lower incomes and so on, might carry a higher privacy risk. So for us, this is not a beneficial situation for the people that we're talking about, right? Because ideally, we want people, regardless of income level, regardless of geographic background, gender, and so on, to be enjoying the same rights. Mm-hmm. We don't want a situation where, going back to the internet example, where we have poor privacy for poor people. This is a trend, however, when we talk about, for example, smart feature phones or feature phones, which often don't have the same levels of user controls around privacy options that that Android currently, the standard Android setup might provide. So it's a tricky balance. I'm not saying that we should try and change the narrative around to make it more palatable to others, but it's important that when we talk about equality for all, we're talking about equal rights. And that is linked to the broader development question that I think a lot of us are concerned with, because having those kinds of equal rights can lead to more beneficial development outcomes, social, economic outcomes for everyone. So going back to your question, I don't know if I answered it as the way you're praising it, but that would be our position.
So I think I want to return to governance, strict data governance issues, but maybe using Vivian's framing of enablers versus safeguards. I think generally when we think about data governance, or maybe when I do, it's kind of with it's the discussion seems to be conducted with more emphasis on risks and safeguarding against those risks. But I want to talk about a more proactive agenda towards supporting inclusivity. And I know that the Web Foundation, I think all of you have worked on projects that support reducing the gender gap on the use of digital tools. So I was wondering if you could each talk about those initiatives. Maybe.
I'm going to start with you.
Okay, go back to Dhanaraj.
Okay, sure. So for a little context then, one of the big issues that we face right now, we're talking about data for development, is people that with the ability to actually produce and use data. And this comes down a lot to the question of who is online. So currently there is a digital gender gap globally. So men are more likely to use the internet than women on average globally. There's a 10 percentage point gap according to International Telecommunications Union right now. So this might vary across countries. In some countries the gap is even bigger, or it might be smaller. But the point is men are more likely to be using the internet. So then that from all points of view, it's an important issue to address. And we can do this at several levels. When we look at how governments think about broadband access and initiatives to improve access, then we would argue, and we have done different kinds of ways of arguing how and showing how we can make those initiatives more gender responsive, more responsive to the specific needs of women and girls when it comes to access and use of the internet. The spillover, the impacts that has when we talk about data, when we talk about big data, for example, and the extent to which big data sets are representative of populations, given that they might come from, say, the extent to which people are using their phones or or online activities and so on, you're going to have non-representative data sets. And this is often a problem, especially it's going to be even more acute in low and middle income countries where these gender gaps are even larger. So from our point of view, we advocate at policy level for more gender-responsive broadband plans, and we have frameworks that we have put out to explain how that can be implemented and how those work. And that, I think, is critical when we talk about the availability and use of data, particularly around this gender gap issue.
If I could jump in here, because I'm itching in my seat. It's an issue that I feel so strongly about. And I'm glad we're finally talking about gender and gender gaps. It's completely agree with the need, and I'm happy with the focus in the last few years on more sex disaggregated data. It's necessary. But what really bothers me right now, and in keeping with the position I'm trying to advocate here for, which is more preparing populations for this data revolution, there need to be more women in data science. There need to be more women in data science here in the developed economies. Did you know that, in fact, there are less women entering pathways that lead to data science and therefore writing those algorithms that are going to be influencing our everyday lives than there were in 1985? So, for example, computer science was a field that attracted about 35% women in 1985. Right now, it only attracts about 17%. And the same is true of mathematics and engineering, a little bit less, but basically there are fewer women data scientists, and they are leaving that career once they enter it. So to me, it's a real problem, because it's even more accentuated than in the developing economies that are then excluded from this process of writing the algorithms that are going to affect them in their development space. And so, I mean, we talked about invisible women, and I feel like unless we attract this, then this sort of nefarious situation that, for those of you who haven't read Caroline Perez's book, Invisible Women, be careful, because it made me upset for a whole week. It's really important to start encouraging more women, and that means into elementary schools and high schools. And I know I've steered to the negative because the picture is so dire in a lot of the places where MCC works, because 2 out of 3 girls drop out of secondary school. 10% of them are encouraged to continue math and science. So these are the kinds of things that even through the data collaboratives for local impact we've tried to do. We've managed to bring up the participation of young women and girls in data literacy, data visualization, and even in that data science program that I mentioned, to close to parity, but it started at 17%. Because there are no role models, because their dads or moms told them that's not for them, etc. So I guess this is an appeal to all of us to make sure that this gap gets closed, so the solutions are stronger by reflecting the needs of women and men and the appropriate variety of stakeholders in the ecosystem.
Can I just ask you what steps you took to get closer to parity?
Yes, so we won't take credit for it, because a big approach we've taken is we've empowered partners in countries. So the Tanzania Data Lab and companies like Tanzania Vora and Sahara Sparks, and in Cote d'Ivoire, it's local partners there, including Cigen. What they have been doing is, first of all, they took an agile approach. That's really kind of an adaptive management approach, if you will, where if they had trainings, they would look at who signs up. If there wasn't enough parity there, they would look for groups that they're trying to have more of. The women that did sign up were asked, well, what worked, what could have been done better. In many occasions, it was something as simple as changing the times of certain trainings, for example, or who the facilitator was. Women do not see themselves reflected. There are no role models. So when there are conferences, which, by the way, this has happened at the Global Women in Data conferences, and all men are on the pictures, that does not help. It's one of the reasons why Stanford Women in Data Science started an all 100% women on the podium data science global event. So those are the kinds of things. The Data Lab has also started reaching out to high schools and working actually with Vodacom, somebody had mentioned them, and UNICEF, to get girls into this and to do coding camps, data/visualization camps, and make them see that this is a in for them. Yeah.
Sure.
I fully agree on the digital gender gap and of course data science gap. Very good, positive solution of how you can actually bring in, more sort of build towards closing the gender data gap. But I also wanted to mention that in the SDG world, when you look at the gender data and sex disaggregated data gaps, it's really, alarming. And the UN just came up with the SDG updates, and almost no indicator has sex disaggregated data. And these are the kind of things that we really need to focus together with the digital gender gap. We really need a gender data revolution. I know it's a buzzword, but we do need to do something about it as sort of collaboration and holding hands. A lot of people are working on, and I know a lot of donors are putting money into trying to understand what interventions are really needed. One thing which we have found out from the work that we have done with Data2X and a lot of other groups, some of them in this room, is that we've tried to find from the gap to go to sort of see what are the causes of these. And when you look at from the gap and you go deep dive into the causes of where these gaps come from, it's not only gaps in sort of somebody forgot to put this question in a questionnaire. Some of it is, some of it's really methodological issues, but a lot of it also there are norms, the sort of social norms at the country level, which actually stand in a way of, for example, birth registrations or marriage and divorce registrations or causes of death for women. So we're really, by looking at the data for gender, we look at a whole slew of other areas that we need to address. And I think we should look at this as a positive sign that we know how to get to some of these really critical issues. Finally, I also wanted to say that based on this methodology of looking at gaps and then going to the problems that need to be solved, my group, again with Data2X, we have costed. How much does it cost to actually, for the countries to fix this? And based on the investments that they are making now, based on the flows that international organizations like World Bank and other donors are providing, the gap for closing, the financial gap for gender data is about 200 million a year for the next years till 2030, which I really don't think is much. If you add up the salary of one or two soccer players, you actually get to that number. So it's really shocking that we haven't been in such a strong groups discussing these issues. We haven't been able to really mobilize financial resources for closing the gender data gap. Thank you.
Just one comment. I think we should also recognize that the observances of these gaps in the sex disaggregated data or in the pipeline in terms of STEM careers or in the access and use of data or in online access and use. All these gaps stem from fundamentally structural problems. Mm-hmm. The word patriarchy is not something that typically comes up in a room like this, but that is one of the issues that we have to recognize. And the onus then often falls at an individual level like us. Although we're talking globally in terms of policies and regulations, often it comes down to individual attitudes, like those of us who have some power to think about these issues differently. And that's a good starting point, especially for the men in the room.
If I can interject with one final addition that I think complements this as well is, again, from the funder space, what can we do? I had given the example earlier about the investment in Côte d'Ivoire, and the schools, large infrastructure incentive, and yet before we agreed to that and for it to be proposed in an evidence-based way, we made it a condition precedent that the Ministry of Education adopt a gender policy and create a gender unit. Again, there's still a long way to go after that because you have to make sure that they act on those policies. But doing things like that as donors, when we notice an absence of the ability to materialize the impact of the particular issue, we can do better at asking for that.
So I think let's kind of shift focus just for a second, and I'm going to talk about promoting good data governance with a very hand-wavy understanding of what good data governance means, but maybe we can dive into that into the question. But it strikes me that many organizations in the development community have published guidelines or frameworks on what responsible use of data looks like. But then most of these have kind of come from humanitarian organizations, and most have been very internally focused. Like, how does the organization use data responsibly? And at the same time, there's a strong and growing demand from national and subnational policymakers looking for similar guidance. So a couple questions along these lines. The first is, do you think that those frameworks, and I don't expect you to have read through most of them or hardly any of them, but there's many of them in existence, do you think they could likely be imported whole cloth to national governments, or are there areas where the debate is still needed and they're lacking consensus? Have you answer that first, and then I'll build on that. It's a tough question.
So I'll be provocative. I'll say that this world of responsible data, it exists because there's been a lack of vision and leadership around data governance writ large. You know, big institutions wouldn't be grappling with what should I do with data if there were kind of real norms out there already, and the systems in place that put those norms in action. So, you know, I think it's not to say I don't laud those efforts. I think it's really important, but I think it signals there's a much bigger problem out there with respect to, you know, how people's data is going to be used, how, you know, and who's making those decisions. And I don't think you can take that language from those frameworks or guidelines and put them into a national level, in part because, you know, when you think about data governance, I think Vivian teed this up quite well, it's not just a matter of what's your personal data protection law, it's also what's your competition policy, you know, it's taxation, it's what institutional reforms, you know, and do you have a second to kind of...
Sure. We can go back to you.
Yeah.
So you have a second to expound on it? Yeah, please do.
So I've been contemplating, you know, what's the difference between Estonia and China? These are two countries who have taken very, very advanced steps towards making data more interoperable. And as a result, their economies have fundamentally transformed. I mean, in both countries, there's almost like predictive public service delivery. In Estonia, you know, you're notified that your kid is now in, you know, this kindergarten. It's only 3 blocks away because they know that you've got, you know, you had your child 3 years ago, and blah, 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 blah. In China too, there's a lot. I mean, it's an amazing transformation in part because of technology and data. What's different, so at a technological level, you can talk about what are those systems of interoperability and what do those look like. And both have actually very strong personal data protection laws. You know, we don't mention that often about China. But they're really radically different. You know, one country has stringent rules around who in government can access what data and for what purpose. And those permissions are baked into the technology. There's a transparency log in Estonia where any citizen can see where your data's been used or uploaded or whatever. And there's just there's a set of redressal systems and oversight mechanisms. So I'm not sure why I went on this tangent, but, you know, I guess I think that, you know, we can't just talk about, first of all, policies without the architecture. We can't just talk about the architecture without also talking about the rights. I mean, it's a whole framework. And so these guidelines that have been established, they're good, but they're, you know, they're trying to fill a gap that's woefully huge right now. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Priya. So, anyone else want to weigh in?
Yeah, just very briefly, I think we have to also recognize the process behind this, as in if you look at what people might call good governance, which then involves the process of consultation and you know, development, following what individuals want, communities, civil society want, then it would not be about copying whole cloth what others have done, but it would be more about that local the policy development process happening locally within these countries. I think we should also in parallel look at when we're talking about what is like a good data governance framework, we should also consider the institutional factors and or elements that can complement and support that. So whether we're talking about data governance in terms of data protection and privacy laws and the institution around that, then you have to also consider the wider ecosystem competition, but also the judicial frameworks that exist, the extent to which these can protect people's rights and so on. There are examples. So, for example, I was talking with one of my colleagues from Zimbabwe talking about the new digital ID system that's being proposed there, and concerns about the extent to which that can actually harm existing forms of governance outside of what we're calling data governance, right? So that wider factor has to come in. It's not, as we all know, when we're talking about in the ICT for the world, it's not just about the technological intervention, but the wider analogs, as the World Bank calls it, that can support the efficacy of that intervention. I think we should think similarly here as well.
Back to your question, I really liked reading some of these sectoral data sharing or data guidelines, and each one of them bring a lot of very, very important elements of what to avoid and what is doable and so on. So they're all very smart. But the ones that I see that work really well are much more focused on the sectors, whether we're talking about humanitarian data or agriculture or health. So one idea when putting on the table is whether we should look at these much more rather than aggregate, because when you go at the global and aggregate level, you lose a lot of the nuances, and you actually have a risk of erring too much on privacy at the cost of accuracy and access. So maybe looking at this at the sectoral level might be one way. Talking about risk, I just wanted to mention one that I think we should really also watch and for the risk, for example, of, like the US Census 2020, which is introduced this differential privacy. And the differential privacy is basically trying to, introduce noise and introduce errors basically in data so that you can, get to higher level of privacy, but at the risk of losing accuracy. And sometimes these overzealous methods of trying to gain privacy could really, take the value out of your equation for getting to the high value for data. So back to the sectoral approach, it might be with the countries involved, and at the sectoral approach, we may be able to avoid some of these risks.
I have a couple more questions I'm burning to ask, but I also want to give time for Q&A. So I think we'll start asking if the audience has questions, and I might turn back to the panel at the end. Right here. And I think we'll take 2 or 3 questions at once and then answer them in a batch.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for all the panelists for a great and insightful discussion about the data as development issue. My name is Henry. I'm with Asian Development Bank. My question is about the development of smart city, which is using for the data to developing and providing better services for the city. Many cities nowadays are trying to promoting these projects for building up a smart city. However, we also have discussions saying that some countries wants to use smart city projects to promote more security, which sometimes can become a violation of personal privacy. If you can give one suggestion to the countries who wants to promote these projects in smart cities, what would it be? Thank you.
Others? Susan?
Priya, I want to ask you a little bit more about your comparison of Estonia and China, because it is a very interesting comparison. And do you know if there's any evidence that the Estonian people asked that data be used to provide better public services? Was there a feedback loop in developing that? Whereas in China, I do get a sense that the use of data is quite popular, but you also get a sense that many Chinese people feel their data is not adequately protected. What's your thought?
Okay, I think we'll take one more before.
We've talked a lot about bridging a gap between gender. I was wondering if you had any efforts in bridging gaps with racial and ethnic diversity in these fields in developing countries or in developed countries.
Great. So why don't we start with the first question, which is about smart cities.
So in terms of smart cities, thanks for that good question, because obviously from a development perspective, you want to optimize the service delivery or the transport in a particular system, and we come across those kinds of proposals within the MCC portfolio. I guess, building also on a good intervention that we had from the Smart City Toronto example, I think what's really important is to create the space for meaningful dialogue as part of that proposal, and especially on the hard issues of privacy, who's going to use the data. And I think in emerging economies, even more so than in other ones. And I think that's, again, the point I'm trying to make here is if you're going to have that kind of balance of use of a new resource, in this case data, you need to make sure those checks and balances are there, that there is a regulatory framework, but that there is sufficient data democratization and understanding that the right questions are asked. I think Stefan said this too, are questions being asked of the data? And then what I would hope is more questions are being asked by the beneficiaries who really shouldn't be beneficiaries. They should be co-contributors to the design of that smart city. So create spaces for meaningful, and what I mean by meaningful is that they're not just listening campaigns, but listening, understanding, changing, iterating the design on that basis, and maybe even giving back the outcomes to the communities that they generate.
Should I answer, Susan?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, so Estonia's story is really interesting, partly because of just where they were historically and the timing. So in 1994, I think it was annexed from the Soviet Union, and we were lucky enough to talk to folks who were writing the constitution of the country when we were there last year. And they were very deliberate in saying, we want to create kind of the opposite of the Soviet Union, create an ultra transparency in the government system, ultra responsive government. And because it was 1994 is just the start of the IT boom, there were actual opportunities through technology to do that. So I don't think I heard from them that there was this deep consultative process around what are we going to do with your data and does it sound right? But certainly it originated from this deep motivation to create a government of people and super responsive. And so I think back to Claire's comment, which is, it was kind of, complicated because at the end of the day, when we're talking about data governance, you're talking about what can governments do to put in place policies and institutions to, ensure data is governed in a way that their people want to. But then the people also have to, understand what they're asking for and have a point of view. And I think in both of the Chinese case and the Estonian case, there wasn't real consultation with people, but it was both are dramatic investments and approaches led by government. Does that help? Okay.
We had the question on bridging other divides, including racial inequalities, maybe both in data science and think you might be pointing to algorithmic bias issues.
Well, yeah, you want to do it?
You go ahead first.
We have probably different answers, so it might be interesting. Well, I just wanted to say that you probably know that the disaggregation of data under this initiative on Leave No One Behind under SDGs is tremendously important part of the development agenda for 2030. And there are 7 categories of disaggregation, and of course the ethnicity is one of those items. But the reality check is that it's very expensive, and it's also, it really hits the issues of the data privacy and security. And I must say that the Global Partnership for GPSTD, Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, has done an initiative called Inclusive Data Charter. And the Inclusive Data Charter is maybe I can have Jenna explain the Inclusive Data Charter, because it actually talks exactly to this. Do you want to?
Sure. Do you want it?
Yeah. Oh, shit.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Shaida. I guess just really briefly, the idea is to establish a set of principles that are quite broad. There are 5 principles, and champions, which come from government, international organizations, civil society organizations, and we have been exploring city level and also private sector, but haven't gotten there. They sign up to 5 principles, but they also develop an action plan. And the action plan articulates the specific actions that they want to take to move those principles forward. And so those principles are all about disaggregation, but they're about inclusion more than they are about the technical details of disaggregation. So they have to do with the ways in which parts of government engage citizens groups to get more granular data about community members. There are actions that relate to strengthening administrative data systems, so those systems in the health sector and the education sector, to get more granularity and understand the experience of people. So all of these different methods, tools, approaches in a sort of concrete way to kind of bridge these divides. But the principles also include a reference to the fundamental principles of official statistics, and very clearly highlight a sort of privacy and confidentiality principle within the kind of quest for more granular data to understand the specific experiences and needs of different population groups.
Thank you. Thanks,
you have something you want to... sorry.
So I just wanted to say one more thing about the smart cities comment, and there my comment is that you really at the smart city you really come to to a tough question of what should be your data governance, and I think it's tremendously important at the start of the design of the work that you be as much as possible inclusive and bringing multiple stakeholders and beneficiaries. So, and all kinds of beneficiaries, because some cities, for example, are suffering a lot right now from homelessness. Los Angeles City, for example, it's a crisis there. So it's really important to bring those voices and those needs into the smart city design and building a secure system around it. Sorry.
Yeah, so on the question about race, and this follows from what Shaida is saying about inclusivity in design, I think the person was asking about in the US in particular. So there is evidence that suggests that people of color in the US are more likely to be surveilled online. There are studies that point to digital redlining, which is historically there's the issue of redlining in terms of housing, but what has followed from that is digital redlining in terms of communities, people of color having access to lower forms of or slower internet speeds, worse services, and so on. There is evidence around AI and discrimination in the criminal justice system in the US. There's lots of other people that are studying that and have shown that to be the case. There's a problem around flawed data sets that don't adequately represent people of color. And when you look at intersections with that and women, for example, then the problems become even more acute. All of these, again, with the discussion about gender, are structural. They stem from flawed designs in systems, but also flawed policy designs, and that comes back to the question is who is involved, what's the process, and who is involved in those discussions from the start. Which communities are involved and which communities are excluded. So the issue around race in the U.S. is not, these examples are then symptomatic of the broader problem around race in the U.S. And it's not necessarily surprising to many of us. Yeah, stop there.
We'll take one more batch of questions, then I'll ask a quick final question. Wrap it up. So now we have a lot more hands. Okay. One here. Yes.
Okay. Hi, Priya from Public Citizen. I know that we're going to talk about the risks next panel, but I couldn't help myself and ask here, because most of the time when we talk about developmental challenges, we talk about like all these high-tech solutions to development problems, and most of these high-tech solutions are based on data collection. Give us more data, let's collect more data, and no one talks about how about the rules which govern these rules. And when I say rules, I've been talking about laws, because we've been there and self-regulation doesn't work, you know? I mean, in this country, we believed in self-regulation for such a long time, and especially self-regulation for tech, and we all like experienced that. It didn't work. And now like the US is discussing the federal privacy law. And after the GDPR, like countries, more and more countries have been introducing privacy laws. But the problem is enforcement is not efficient. I mean, I work for a consumer organization. We've been doing lots of studies about the websites and apps. Like even in Europe, like most of the apps that the Europeans use, they share data, you know? It's like the front end, like you receive all these like cookie notices, back end, like the data has been shared with third parties. So, and when it comes to developing countries, because there are no rules and regulations in place, even if they have the rules like in the books, there is no enforcement. And then we are coming up with all these like developmental solutions. Data, let's collect more data, let's process more data. But we don't think about what happens to that data. Like, okay, one party collected the data, for instance, with biometric identity. Most of the donors have been like pushing for that in Africa. But do we really need biometric identity? Because we are discussing ban of facial recognition here in the US. And then you go to Africa and tell them like, oh, we need your biometric data. What happens to that data after it's collected? Whether it has been, I mean, no one thinks about this.
Ask a question.
Yeah, so the question is, do we really need high-tech solutions to or development challenges? Can we do it like in a simple way?
Thank you, Richard. One question up here and a couple then hands.
There seems to be a presumption that governments are going to be responsible for governance. And I'm from India, and I'm very concerned about the way data is being misused and used in my country. And for a fact, the Indian government's Road and Transport Ministry sold driver registration and vehicle registration data of its citizens to both private sector and government agencies for a price. And with the new data protection law that's been tabled in the Indian Parliament, the government gets a wide exception on data protection as well. So my question is, if you're going to rely on the government to set rules of engagement regarding how data is going to be used and the governance of data, and then they themselves are exempt from any rules of governance, where does that leave us in terms of using data? Thank you.
Sunil Sharma from the Institute for International Economic Policy. This morning I've been sitting here and trying to tease out what the huge amount of data that we're now able to generate and collect is it changing in terms of what we need to do in terms of a policy response. And So when I think about it, there's been very little discussion about statistical capacity development, right? Because it then takes us back to the much more traditional issues of education, universities, health, and all the other issues. So talking about data as a development issue, we can generate a lot more data. And as the previous two questions have asked, there's very little attention being given to what are we going to do with this data, or how can we do something with this data, or do we have the statistical capacity in the developing countries to use this data productively, right? If all this data that can be collected and generated in the developing world can only be used by partners who are going to come from the developed country, we need to be able to develop local capacity, right? And I'm coming from a very macro viewpoint, because I used to run the IMF's institute in the Asia Pacific for about a decade. And there, we started collecting a lot of macro data, but we soon found that the local statistical offices could not provide reliable data even for, say, quarterly GDP figures or monthly GDP figures and so on and so forth. So unless you develop those capacities, both for collection and analysis, this data is not going to be very useful at a local level, or it's going to be very difficult to utilize at a local level. And you say, okay, how can I make this data useful? Then you go back to the more traditional development issues of, we have to develop the capacity to analyze the patterns or why they're useful and so on and so forth. So the question is, what is being done locally to make sure that this data can be used by the locals, not by foreign partners, not by sophisticated partners coming from outside, to tell them how to use the data.
Thank you. So those are three pretty meaty questions, so let's take a break there and answer those.
I can start.
Okay.
On your question regarding relying only on governments, I think what I was saying, my model is government plus plus. And the government plus plus model is that we do have, multi-stakeholders. Governments, of course, are the drivers and they're accountable for the delivery of the services and accountable for, addressing the issues of the democratic society. But we also more and more have to rely on, civil society organization, a more independent organization that could really speak up at the international level and national level. And I think, for example, groups like mine, they're a small group, but we've had a big voice in sort of calling countries to task on not releasing their data according to, it's been paid for by public funds, but the data is not released or for no good reason, because it's been collected and it's there. So I think the voice of the civil society is tremendously important. And of course, Claire mentioned the role of the UN. I think we have underused the UN power. We can do much more with the UN as a force behind this new data governance model. So the idea that I have is not still count on the countries, but really, bring these other groups into and pay attention to the voice of independent groups that call groups to task and give them energy and give them power. I'm actually very self-serving at this point, sorry. And give them money. And to your question on too much data and how can we make the data useful at the local level, I think what we've been talking about, we haven't had time, but we use data for a variety of reasons, for decision making, for monitoring, for local decision, national decision, international decision. We in the data business, we actually differentiate a little bit, but all the time we are thinking of how can we push data through the value chain to increase its value. And the value is impact, whether it's at the local level and national level. So we stand behind that very much so. And I think more and more now I'm changing my definition of what is data quality. Data quality for me now is fit for use. And fit for use in your term is really to have local impact. So what we have to do is pay more attention to building capacity at local level. And when we set up this new governance process, it has to be very, sort of inclusive of the needs of the local communities. So I stand very much behind what you're saying.
I will just add to that because I think it's similar. What has been done, not enough. I think there is now attention to the need to, in parallel with the investment, so whether it's MCC or other funders, to also make sure that you leverage the in-country system, that you don't go around it. And what I mean by the in-country system, it's not just the National Bureau of Statistics or Office and the statistical capacity, but even some of their key stakeholders, because if you go into a country, they have focal points then in all the ministries, and that data stream is supposed to be functional and integrated. And I think the reason why there hasn't been enough investment is it's not as simple. Building kind of the local ecosystem and skills and talent takes longer. There's less there's no ribbon cutting around it. But it's also more affordable. So one of the things that's mind-boggling to me is why isn't there like a 1% set aside of all large donor-funded programs in countries to ensure that you don't just leave behind, but you leave behind a management information system that is fit for purpose, as Shaida was saying, but that also the people using it within the ministries know about it, and the civil society, whether it's in education space, know what information is there that they can begin asking about their schools or health centers, etc. So more needs to be done on the capacity building angle, if that makes sense. Because you're right, it's not us making those decisions and doing that data analytics. I think to achieve that balance of power, it needs to be done in the country itself.
I'll just briefly respond to the issue around process, which is something I mentioned earlier. I just want to reiterate that when we talk about data governance, good data governance, then we have to talk about the process itself. So it's not so much about trying to identify the ideal kinds of policy recommendations or guidance that we can provide to partner governments or others, but it's also the process and how we develop those in the first place, which addresses this, goes back to your question or concern with what's happening in India. On Burchu's question, so I really empathize at this point, and I've in many other conferences or locations, I also raise this issue that often, and this is maybe controversial because here we are gathered around the issue of the data, but often we become too enamored with the technical solution to development problems, and you see this in the ICT for the community a lot, and perhaps sometimes there may be more instances where we should pause and hesitate and question whether this is a data-driven solution is the best solution or whether that is what we need right at the moment. What I would also say, though, in parallel is that things are moving ahead even with that kind of hesitance in mind. Everyone is, even outside of government, or governments and their corporate partners and others are moving ahead in that sense. So we still need something. Some kinds of frameworks in place, which comes back to the questions that have been raised earlier.
Thanks. I think we have time for one or two more questions if there are any. If not, I'll ask kind of a two-parter. You can, Priya, did you have something to say?
Well, I've just been kind of sitting here trying to think of a response to this question around Modi and, are we asking governments to do something they inherently don't want to do? And I can't think of any other actor we need to influence than government. I mean, civil society is a channel, but to whom? To get government to do something. The UN is needed, but to get member states to do something. This week, OMB in the US has just released the data blocking rule in health. Many Americans, you might want to look this up, but it's a rule that's basically saying any healthcare provider in the US must now share patient data with the patient. And if a healthcare provider doesn't, they're fined $1 million per instance. Sounds great, right? I should have access to my patient data, right? The data blocking rule also allows any sketchy app to say, well, I got Priya's consent, and now I'm authorized to ask for her medical records on her behalf. And the data blocking rule will fine that healthcare provider $1 million if that sketchy app asks and they don't deliver. Government can be a huge force for good, a huge force for massive mistakes. We've been on the Hill a lot lately about this particular issue on data blocking. And, I think government just has to get it right. But the conundrum here and the pickle we're in is that data is power, and by asking them to, cut off their right arm and say they're not going to access data in times of emergency or for national security purposes or whatever, it may be an uphill battle. Mm-hmm. And when I talked about Estonia, what's so remarkable about Estonia is that they have the permissioned government access to data so specifically. It's not just when can government access data, it's which ministry, not just which ministry, but which function within ministry and which individual. And that's an incredible amount of accountability and kind of restraint that they've introduced. And I agree, India has created a loophole that's big as a bus, and we should be worried.
And Priya, is your sense that that's because they were able to leapfrog forward? They learned on the mistakes? I mean, you had mentioned, I think, when you first started talking about this, that they came in at a time when the ICT space was sort of evolving, and so they could reimagine it from scratch based on all the other, or?
No, but I mean, countries around the world right now are drafting data protection legislation. They could as easily say, these are the moments when government can kind of peek into personal data. But by and large, they're saying, well, government has rights over your data for, national security and other kind of things, and it's a pretty big loophole, and I think it is creating a lot of fear around, when they do that. And it's happening in the US, right? Law enforcement asking tech companies for data and whatever.
So I think we'll switch to a lightning round question to close, but I'll give you two options. First is, has there been something you've heard today that's kind of lit a fuse for you or changed your mind on something? And the second you could tackle is, what have we missed in these conversations? Obviously, we just did an hour and a half on data governance. We never mentioned ownership or sovereignty or localization. So we're just scratching the surface. Are there any issues that you think we completely missed? And I'll take moderator's prerogative. And I think as a co-organizer of the event, we made a huge mistake in not inviting the private sector, because we're having these conversations about the right on data collection and data reuse, and we don't have actors representing the organizations that are doing the bulk of that collection and the bulk of that reuse. So I think it calls for a second conference, but that's Shaida.
I start by, I think two things that we should really talk more about is this public-private partnership around data, and also what are the issues or what are the challenges or what are the opportunities, both maybe building incentives for a data exchange, but also looking at the sort of the mechanisms of what has worked and what we could do more. It's very difficult, but I think it's doable. The other thing we haven't talked about is really much more legal aspects of all these regulations and data governance, and it's really useful to have legal people, lawyers, in fact, discussing that with us. I know one of our friends, Mike, that is very much working in this space, has been making a lot of, Tom Morrell has been making a lot of advancements on what are some of the discussions around, sort of the regulations and the legal side of this. But overall, I think it's been very rich discussion, so you've covered very well.
Okay. Anyone else want to take you light? You can be very lightning about it, like 2 sentences.
Sure. One thing that still I think is a question for a lot of us, if we're diving into the weeds, is around, and if we're looking at that individual level, is around ways to really promote that individual agency. What kinds of controls, mechanisms can people really use in an informed and meaningful way? For example, giving consent, or kinds of controls they can have over their data that they can really understand and really use. And I don't think there's no obvious solution to that yet, but it's something that I think we could have talked more about.
I think the conversation highlighted for me how there's kind of risks and opportunities to introduce safeguards at all levels of the value chain. So, whether it's around data collection and whose data is being collected or who's actually using it and making sure there's the capacity to use it. I mean, just all along the chain, I think there's a lot to dig into.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to delegate my right for ending and point to somebody that I know is in the audience, Paige, because for me, we haven't talked enough about the additional challenge of the rural-urban divide. And so I kind of wanted to ask Paige to talk a little bit about one way that we're trying to encourage that conversation.
Thank you so much, Agnieszka, and thank you everyone and conference organizers for organizing this. So I'm with Development Gateway. We're working quite closely with MCC as well as a number of other organizations on issues of data and technology and evidence use. And in particular, the initiative we're working on right now is trying to develop principles for subnational data use. So looking at really the unique challenges and opportunities of focusing on really achieving that last mile of leave no one behind, which will happen at the local level by bringing in people from the local level. So we're working on holding a number of different consultations with community groups with a particular focus on sub-Saharan Africa, but quite keen to speak with others working in other areas of the globe to identify kind of a series of best practices based on case studies and what's worked in other areas for other funding organizations and governments and implementing partners to consider when working in subnational contexts. So very keen to talk with folks during the break and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.
Excellent delegation, but I'm not letting you off the hook.
Oh, come on. Okay, then I'll say one more thing, just to maybe end it on a positive note. The speed of change, like if you could envision an exponential graph at how quickly we're going through these changes, is also a real opportunity. Again, if we're thinking from the development standpoint, because again, of the youth bulge in a lot of these places, where if we really focus on getting this right in the next 10, 15 years, we will catch a generation and in some ways help those countries leapfrog forward and make them better prepared for that hopefully secure, interoperable, well-meaning digital global economy.
So thank you all. I think it's time to break for coffee, but please join me in giving a hand to our panelists for